Welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon, and I'm the host of A Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present, and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs.
Welcome everyone to the podcast. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Welcome newcomers to the podcast. We love having new people come on board. I'd like to welcome Misty Adoniou, Adjunct Associate Professor at University of Canberra and Principal Fellow, Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and a leader in literacy research and practice. Welcome, Misty. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Phil. And I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country. So I'm in Canberra.
Oh, okay. And that's where you're based, aren't you, in Canberra?
I am indeed. Based here. Usually get to travel all over the country, but COVID's put a bit of a damper on that.
And you're travelling by Zoom now?
Yes.
Yeah. And, Misty, can you tell us a bit about your background?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I began my education career as a primary school teacher, and I was a primary school teacher for many years here in Canberra. Then I travelled overseas, and it turns out teaching's quite a portable little job to have, and so overseas teaching took me to Greece. But also being there took me to marriage as well, because I married a local while I was over there.
Right.
So I was in Greece for a decade or so, and I had kids there as well and taught there as well. But then we came to Australia. So I came back and I imported my husband. And I went back into teaching, but quickly moved into the university, teaching undergraduate programs, focus on literacy, but also teaching English as an additional language, since that had become my specialty while I was teaching in Greece.
Fantastic. And what have you been up to lately?
So, well, I've actually now retired from the university. So I was at the university for more than a decade, I guess. And I found myself doing more and more work with schools and spending less and less time in my undergraduate classes. And I found I really liked doing the work in school work because I felt like the research finds its way much more quickly into classroom practice when you can pass the research directly on to teachers. So I thought, why not make this a full-time job? And to do that, I left the university. So I retired really from the university and began consultancy work. And so I work with a lot of systems around the country, both the public school systems, the Catholic education offices around the country, and also a couple of the independent school services in the jurisdictions. So that's what I've been doing, working in the field of literacy, mostly around writing, spelling and grammar, but also in the field of teaching English as an additional language.
Right. And so you find this pretty rewarding, I'm sure, because you've really gone deeply into this. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Like I said, I've found that, so I loved working with undergraduate teachers, but it's a bit of delayed gratification really, because you're never quite sure what kind of an impact you're having on undergrads, because, you know, it's a few years before they're out into schools, and, you know, do they remember anything they did at university? It's hard to tell, Phil. But when I work directly with teachers in their classrooms, in their schools, I know that they take the ideas and try them in their classrooms because I'm still usually hanging around to see that happen. Usually I work with schools not just on a one-off basis. I work with schools or systems over a year usually, so we get to see real kind of shifts in teachers' learning, but also real shifts in student outcomes. So, it's incredibly rewarding.
That's great. Is there an ideal sort of model, the frequency of visits or how much time you spend with the school? Is there an ideal sort of situation, or is it varies?
I think it varies. Depends on where the school's up to in their own kind of professional learning journey and what the school wants to achieve. A nice model is to work with the teachers, say, 3 times over the year, and to have some kind of culminating celebration of the work after those 3 visits, so that we can all kind of take stock of what we've achieved. And it's a nice way to do accountability, really, to do a celebration of how we think we've moved on in our learning and how we think the kids have moved on in their learning. And when I'm really lucky and systems and schools have got long-term kind of visions of professional learning, I work with schools over more than a year. So after having done some intensive work, maybe in a first year, I revisit them again in a second year and then in a third year.
Yeah, that's even better. Yeah.
Yeah,
you've got that long-term approach because change takes a while, doesn't it, to really embed change?
Yeah. And not only that, school staff changes a lot. So you do need to go back and kind of inject a bit of learning into newcomers and give the original teachers a bit of a pat on the back for what they're doing, encouragement and some new ideas now that they've consolidated the original learning, some new ideas on how to build upon that learning. So, for example, I might work with teachers and schools over a year looking at narrative writing if I'm in a primary school, and then we might up the ante, then build upon really strong foundations, and I'll do a revisit in a second year and have a look at non-narrative writing. So that's the kind of thing we might do.
Working with a literacy leader in the school helps, does it? Or somebody that leads the others? Yeah,
exactly. So I'll tell you who it's good to work with. It's good to have the principal there. So the principal usually is the person who's invited me in to the school. And I like them to be not just the people who invited me. They usually invite me because they've heard me speak at a principal's network or at a conference. So they've usually heard me give a pithy and engaging 1-hour lecture. And they thought, oh, that sounds kind of intriguing. That sounds like it might be something we're looking for. She sounds like a pretty engaging speaker. My teachers might be up for listening to her. And so that's usually how I arrive in a system or a school. But then I like the principals to hang around and really hear what it is that we're trying to achieve, because ultimately they'll be responsible for leading the change. And they do the pragmatic things, Phil, like making sure that people have some time off to do some extra planning. And, I need those people to be involved. And when I'm working with secondary schools, and increasingly I do, I really need the deputy principal to be involved, because they're the ones usually in charge of those pragmatic things like scheduling and timetabling. And you need those if professional learning is really going to take off in a complex place like a secondary school. You really need somebody in there to manage logistics for you.
And that really leads us into our topic today, which is effective literacy teaching in high schools. How did you come to start working? Did you start in primary and then you worked your way into high schools? How did it happen? Yeah.
How did I come to be in so many secondary schools, given that I trained myself as a primary school teacher?
Yeah.
I had my first insights into secondary schools while I was lecturing at the university, because I took a couple of kind of literacy units for secondary teachers. So I ran a couple of those while I was teaching at the university, and that gave me some insights into some of the literacy demands in secondary school, and a few visits to schools to watch teachers pre-service teachers doing their practicums in secondary school. And I became really interested in this whole new area, really, because literacy in the secondary school is a different beast to literacy in the primary school.
Yeah.
And then I started to get quite a lot of invitations from secondary school principals, once again off the back of usually hearing me speak at a system network conference that are given to leaders. So usually a leaders conference somewhere, and they've heard me speak.
Yeah.
And the reason they ask me in is because they're intrigued by what I say about literacy in the secondary school, because it's probably different from what most people say.
Yeah, it is. Sharon has worked in some high schools here in South Australia. It's very different to the primary school setting.
It is. And the thing that I think that perhaps appeals to people about what I'm saying is, there's been issues around literacy in secondary school for decades, right?
Yep.
It's been a thing for a very long time.
Yep.
The secondary school teachers have been given the mantra, you're all teachers of literacy for decades now.
Yes.
And I perhaps refreshingly come in and say, you know what, I don't actually think you are all teachers of literacy. And I think that's kind of a little relief for a few of the teachers, but everybody's curious about why I say that.
Okay.
Given that we've been trying to convince everybody that they're all teachers of literacy, why is this literacy person coming in and saying, well, you're not really?
Right. Okay.
So what am I claiming then? If they're not all teachers of literacy, what am I saying?
That's my question.
I'm saying to the discipline teachers, so the maths teacher, the science teacher, the history teacher, the geography teacher, the tech teacher, I'm saying to them, I'm not expecting you to teach these kids to read and write. I'm asking you to apprentice them into reading and writing like an historian. I'm asking you to apprentice them into reading and writing like a scientist does.
Okay.
So I'm not asking you to do the work of the English teacher. I'm asking you to let your kids in on how language works in your discipline, because the bottom line is, my friends, science teachers, only you know how language works in science. So we really, really need you to be helping our kids understand how language works in science. And that's our job. That's the job in secondary school. And that's not a Misty idea, Phil. That's really an idea coming out of a response to why this mantra of you're all teachers of literacy kind of hasn't had much of a payoff, because we've been saying it for decades, but there hasn't been much of a payoff. And so the research has kind of been investigating that idea, So what is going on then? And it's in the last decade or so, there's been a shift to say, well, probably when we've said to teachers, you're all teachers of literacy, we've gone in with our English hats on and given teachers very English strategies to use in their science classroom or in their maths classroom or in their geography classroom. And it turns out the strategies for reading and writing poetry are not all that helpful for reading or writing a worded problem in maths.
Yep.
So this new kind of field is, well, actually, we're talking about disciplinary literacy. And that would mean that we wouldn't use English strategies. We'd look to see what strategies are needed to read in science, what strategies are needed to read in history.
Yeah. Can you give an example, like in science or?
Yeah, sure. So one of the classic strategies that we've kind of given as a general literacy toolkit strategy, and it's come out straight out of English, has been this idea of we'll just kind of skim and scan to look for key points, look for the key ideas.
Yep.
And it's quite a good strategy in the more wordy English texts that we might have,
Yep.
but it's a really poor strategy in maths and science, because maths and science, by their very nature as a discipline, haven't got a lot of redundancy. So you can't really afford to skim and scan. You really do have to pay attention to every detail. So if you imagine a maths worded problem, I can almost guarantee you that there were no irrelevant words in there. You really have to know what every one of those words is meaning in that context if you're going to understand what the question is asking you to do. So a skim and scan strategy is not a great strategy in maths, and usually not in science either.
Yeah. I bet you're going to say vocabulary is key.
Yeah, vocabulary is always the key, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you know what? It's the best way in but I think there's more than vocab. I really talk to science teachers, for example, about grammar, because the grammar of science is quite different from the grammar of English, for example.
Okay.
But I can't start with that, because that's going to put off my science teachers, because that sounds like I'm about to turn them all into English teachers or linguists, and they don't really have an interest in that. So my starting place is always with vocabulary, because science teachers and history teachers and art teachers and music teachers and tech teachers know that their vocab is different from the vocab of the other discipline areas. And so vocab is a really good starting place to work with secondary teachers in all of the disciplines, because they already know it's special and technical and specific. And so then we talk about ways to teach vocab to kids. And really I'm asking them to look beyond just glossaries, which is usually kind of the first place to go. It's like, okay, I know I have, this is specialist vocabulary, so we'll write a glossary up and a definition, and, that'll do.
Yep.
I want them to understand how to go deeper with the kids beyond a glossary. I want them to unpack the word with the kids so that the kids get a good understanding of not just the word and how to spell it and what it means, but also to understand the underlying concept, because that's the beauty of vocabulary in maths and science, for example, is it doesn't just teach you what the word means if you examine it. You learn what the underlying mathematical concept is. So if I give an example, so let's just take perimeter. As a mathematical concept, right? Perimeter is this thing where you have to measure around the edges of a shape, for example, and add it up to find the perimeter. When you add all those sides up, what does it come to? And so the word itself, perimeter, tells you that's what you're supposed to do, because peri means around and meter means measure. So the word itself is giving you the mathematical clue of what you're supposed to do. And once you've told the kids that, then suddenly you don't have kids not remembering what's the difference between perimeter and area again, because the word itself is telling you. And then once you've taught them about meter meaning measure, then we've got a whole lot of other words that are going to be easy to unpack. So then maybe a thermometer, we can say, okay, so a thermometer measures what? Thermo, heat. Okay, so thermo is heat. And then when they go to PE and they're reading about thermoregulation or hypothermia or hyperthermia, it's like, oh, okay, so that's about heat. So what's the hypo bit about and what's the hyper bit about? So that kind of exploration, a deeper dive into vocabulary. And that's a really excellent way in with secondary teachers, because it doesn't feel to them like they're wasting their time. Because I know now, from having spent quite a long time in secondary schools, that one of the biggest issues that secondary teachers have is, I've got so much content to get through and so little time with the kids. I can't be doing this other work. And so when we present the work like this, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's kind of doing my content work as well as the language work. I can see why I would spend time on that.
And I suppose maths and science is helped by the Greek and Latin origins of words.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially those two subject areas.
Yeah, although, you know what, it goes across all of the subject areas because, you've heard me pull apart those kind of Greek and Latin roots. We know that by the time, I was really looking at the roots or the prefixes or the suffixes. So we call those the morphemes of a word, the meaning parts of the word, the base, the prefix, the suffix. And we know that by the time kids get into secondary school, up to 80% of the words that they now encounter in secondary school are multi-morphemic words that they probably haven't encountered before.
Wow.
So that's a lot of words that they come across every day that they haven't seen before, that a teacher cannot be expected to be teaching every single one of those words.
No.
And so what we need is to give the kids skills to recognise how to unpack those words, which is why having learnt thermo in PE, when they did, hypothermia and learning that it meant heat, is going to be useful when they then come across thermoregulation in science, because they've already got an idea of what thermo is. So it must be, thermoregulation must be about regulating or making right your temperature, your heat. So we're giving, it's kind of a very time-efficient way of helping kids unpack large words that they've never seen before, so that they can make their way and comprehend these texts that they're given. And Phil, consider this, right? When you're the science teacher, you're just kind of teaching science all day. So your head is in the science space, and you kind of forget that your kids have actually just come from history. And before that, they were in English. And before that, they were in tech. And before that, they were in PE. So the kids don't have the luxury of immersion in science all day, every day. They're kind of bopping from one disciplinary world to another 5 or 6 times a day, every day. So they need every bit of guidance and help that we can give them to navigate their way through that really complex day that we give them every day.
Yeah, who invented this thing of having to jump from subject to subject? I mean, it's, I often think of you go into an animation studio and you work on your animation and you don't jump to something else. This is when you're in the workforce. You stay on that animation work all day,
absolutely. Yeah. It's a challenging way that we've set up secondary education, and I'd love to think that we could change it, but clearly we're not going to. So what I say instead to teachers is, can we make the very best we can of this thing that we've set up for kids, this kind of teletransporting every hour on the ring of a bell into another world? Can we actually make that an exciting thing? Can we explain to the kids that that's exactly what we're doing to them? Can we say, when they come into us in their first year of secondary school, can we say, this is going to be amazing, kids. You are going to be transported into a different world every hour, every 2 hours. And there in that world, you're going to meet an expert who's going to apprentice you into a whole new way of understanding the world. You think Doctor Who was cool in his TARDIS going from one place to another? We've got that and more here in secondary school. By the time you leave us in secondary school, you will have been introduced into all of these ways of knowing and understanding the world. That's the real potential of the system that we've set up. I just don't think that we as teachers have realised that's the potential, and certainly we've never explained it to kids that that's the potential. I think kids just think it's all a bit random. Really, the ideal world is that we are encouraging them to be scientists, mathematicians, historians. We're really going into that field, into that discipline, into that field, and how you use strategies and vocabulary within that discipline. Exactly. Like that's the exciting potential, right? That we're giving them it's the exciting potential of a generalist education, that inside this generalist education you will be introduced to the specificities of different ways of knowing the world, which is essentially what a discipline is, right? So the disciplines kind of weren't handed down by God or something a few thousand years ago or 2,000 years ago. They have built up out of different groups of people thinking differently about the world, and hence we get these new disciplines that arise. So the science disciplines are kind of new, and they were kind of on the back of a new way of understanding what's happening around us. So we're talking about the age of enlightenment. We're kind of in the past the Dark Ages into the Middle Ages and beyond, where people started to think, oh, hang on, there could be. So there were people who were observing the world around them thinking, perhaps there's another way to understand phenomena rather than just thinking that it's an act of a greater being. Maybe there's something else to observe, and hence we kind of had a scientific model of thinking. And with that came, okay, well, if we're going to think that through observation we might understand how the world works, then a whole way of operating developed, and that was the ability to repeat the observation, to collect data from the observation, to look for patterns from the observation, and then to make a conclusion based on those observations, and then to share that entire process with a field of peers who would then test your observations by taking what your process and repeating the process in another context. And so that's the scientific method. And that's the kind of thing you want to apprentice your kids to in science and maths. Now, the thing about that way of making sense of the world is that it necessarily dictates a different way to use language. So the words are different, but also the way you organize the words on the page are different. Okay. So you don't see words like I in there, like, oh, I did this and then I saw that, because the scientific method says, no, we should be able to objectively observe. The person should be able to be removed from the observation so that somebody else can take that process and repeat it. And so it's not because scientists don't like people that science teachers keep saying, I don't want you to say I did this or I thought this or I felt this. They say it because they're actually saying, well, in this way of understanding the world, you're not necessary. We don't need to have your personal opinion in there. We're talking about a third-person observation that we can pass on to somebody else. Now, in music, the music teacher may say to the kids, I want you in your response. I want to hear your voice. Because in the arts, we're usually asking people to observe what's going on around you and to reflect on it personally. What does it mean to you? Yeah. How do you think about this? Yeah. And so a music teacher is going to ask for a voice. It wants to hear you in that piece of writing. Yeah. Now, unless we explain these things to kids, our kids just think, I don't know, I've got one teacher who says I'm allowed to say I when I write, and I've got another one who said, no, you can't. And then I've got another one who says, oh, you can use it in the last paragraph. Yep. They just think teachers are being idiosyncratic and weird and random. They don't know that those teachers are actually talking about, well, this is how you write in my discipline. And that's what teachers need to say. They need to say it out loud to the kids, and they need to explain why the discipline wants writing in that way, because it's not trivial. It's really instructive in understanding how that discipline makes sense of the world.
There was just such an incredible change in human history when all this different thinking came in. Just to understand it in a wider context is very important, I think. Yeah.
And exciting for kids. I mean, isn't that the exciting thing? Isn't that what makes learning exciting? I think all of this talk helps kids in high school understand what they're doing in high school. Because I think they're not really sure why they're there for. They're kind of marking time until they get to leave, or they're those other kinds of kids who are just like, well, I'm not asking questions. I'm just putting my head down because I like to get A's. You know, there's got to be more to it, and there is more to it. Yeah. And it'd be great if in secondary school we pass that on to kids, because that kind of brings me to two of the big things that teachers are trying to solve in secondary school. So normally I get asked in because the kids aren't writing well. Yep. The teachers notice it and complain all the time. These kids can't write at all. Every discipline tells me the same thing. Oh, God, they can't write. Yep. And then the leadership team says to me, yeah, our scores are really poor in NAPLAN. You know, we hardly get any movement between the year 7 and 9, according to NAPLAN writing results. And they do. Most schools, it doesn't matter whether you're a disadvantaged school or a highly advantaged school, the NAPLAN data says that we don't add much value between year 7 and year 9. Wherever you are, in whatever state you're in and whatever socioeconomic status school you're in, it's kind of the same story. So both teachers and leaders, although they're coming at it from a different perspective, are saying something wrong with this kid's writing. And so then the idea is, well, so what is going on with their writing? I ask teachers first, what do you think is going on with their writing? And there's kind of two big main ideas that they say. One is they say, I don't know, they have no skills. They don't know how to use punctuation. They can't spell. I don't know what they did down in primary school. That's kind of their one thing, you know, they just have no skills. And another group of teachers often say, I don't know, they just don't want to write.
Right.
Like I think they can, but they don't want to. They can't be bothered. And so then those teachers will say, they just find it more interesting to be on their devices. So their position is that maybe kind of technology has destroyed the will to write is kind of their thinking. And other teachers say, well, technology's just destroyed their skill in writing because, you know, they don't have to write very much and they don't have to spell correctly. So that's kind of the feel that I get when I ask teachers and leaders, so what do you think is going on that your kids are not writing well? So that comes down to a lack of motivation from the kids that we're trying to solve and a lack of skill with the kids that we're trying to solve. So that's really my work with teachers. Is say, okay, well, if that's what we're saying, they're not motivated and they don't have the skills, what are we going to do to give them the skills and to build their motivation? So what do we need to do that? And I do like to kind of knock on the head pretty quickly that I don't think it's a technology thing. I don't think it's because the kids are on their devices all of the time. I just think that that's kind of a bit of a furphy and distracts us from what's really going on with the kids. So let's take the skill thing first, Phil.
Okay.
When teachers are saying, oh, don't they teach them anything in primary school?
Yeah.
No, they teach kids in primary school, but there's no way primary school can teach kids how to write a lab report. Teachers can't. Teachers in primary school don't teach kids how to write a text response to a novel. Teachers in primary school don't teach kids to write a product evaluation in tech. That's not what teachers in primary school do. They do other kinds of teaching of writing, but they don't do those kinds of teaching of writing.
Yeah.
So those skills that we're lamenting that the kids don't have when they write their product evaluation or when they write their research report in PE or when they write their lab report in science, we can't lament that they don't have those skills if we didn't teach them to them. We would have to teach them those skills. And so it's inevitable that we will have to teach those skills, which is why I say to secondary school teachers, I'm not saying that you have to teach them literacy. I'm saying you have to teach them how to write like a scientist, write a lab report like a scientist. Because who else will do it? Nobody knows how to do it.
No.
English teacher can't do it. The English teacher's busy teaching them how to write poetry.
Yeah.
So they can't teach them how to write a lab report. And so that's that skill thing that I try to explain to secondary teachers. And then the first problem that we strike then, of course, is while science teachers know a good lab report when they read one, of course, they didn't do any kind of language and literacy in their undergraduate degrees. Most secondary teachers just did a 1 year kind of add-on to their undergrad degree, a 1 year teaching add-on. And there was no time in that to talk about how you teach kids to read and write like a scientist or how you teach kids to read and write like an historian. So they feel nervous and not well equipped to do that work. So my work is to work with those discipline teachers and say, I promise you can do this. You know so much about your topic. You know all about forensic science. It's a complicated topic that you know that you did and loved in your undergraduate degree. It will be so easy for you to wrap your head around how the language of a science report works. Compared to the knowledge that you already hold in your heads, this is not difficult knowledge for you. So that's when we just need a school to step in and give these teachers both the time for the professional learning and then the time to work with the others in their faculty to imagine then how that new professional learning about how language is working in the sciences, how that can then find its way into their unit planning.
That's great. So just as an example, I'm a science teacher and I'm wanting to change my approach in a lesson. What are some things I need to change about my routines or practices?
Yep.
Just initially, what I might do that would be helpful to me. I know we can't cover everything in the podcast, but just some tips.
Yep. Definitely. So I'm going to use the lab report example again because every year 7, year 8, year 9 student has to write a lab report. And all the year 9 teachers would be cheering in the hallways if year 7 kids got this lab report under control. Because then the year 9 teachers would not have to spend their time reteaching it again and again and again. So let's use the lab report. Now, in the lab report, we're quite lucky in science. It has really defined components. So I'm going to take a couple of the components of the lab report that science teachers are most disappointed in. So they're most disappointed in how kids write hypotheses.
Right.
They're disappointed in how kids write method. And they're disappointed in how kids write conclusions. So those are the kind of most text-laden components of a lab report. The others are usually reporting results in tables or drawing graphs, etc.
Yep.
So we unpack what it is, what constitutes a good hypothesis, what is a good hypothesis. And I really encourage science teachers to go beyond the textbook that they work on with their kids and go revisit their science specialty.
Yep.
And bring that excitement back into their classroom. So if their undergrad degree was forensic science or if their undergrad degree was focused on nutritional science, find that enthusiasm again for your undergrad degree that led you into that in the first place and bring that into the classroom for the kids. So even though your year 7 unit says that you have to do, a unit of work on friction or gravity, you can bring in your own exciting science experiences from your undergraduate degree and in the process show them how the writing up was done. So when you in your undergraduate degree, how did you have to write up the experiments that you did? And that way the kids get to see that this format that you want them to write isn't, just like an impost that's being put on them. It's part of that big idea that I said of how you report the scientific method so that other scientists can read it. And so what we're doing is showing them the authenticity of the writing so that they really do feel like they're being apprenticed into this science world. And then we can unpack, let's say, the hypothesis So the hypothesis, the beautiful thing about science writing is that it's really to the point. So we can find the hypothesis even in a complicated science report, and one that's been written by a scientist. We can find it, and it kind of always follows a similar kind of structure. So we can unpack that for the kids. So hypothesis is usually written in a couple of ways. You're either clued into the fact that it's a hypothesis because it says the hypothesis is, right? Yep. Or it uses some kind of cause and effect structures, like if this happens, the effect will be this, and then there's some kind of reference to the scientific theory behind it, because according to the first law of physics, blah, blah, blah. So there's usually some link to a scientific thinking that gave you that hypothesis. Scientists don't come up with hypotheses just because they dreamt them. They link them to a scientific theory. So that's really what you want your kids to understand about hypothetical thinking, hypothesis creation when they're writing. And the way to do it is to unpack how a few hypotheses have been written, like real ones. Yep. And then you start, when you're doing your pracs with your kids, so you're doing the demonstration pracs, you make sure that you use that in your oral language, use that hypothesis language. Yep. So that the kids get to hear it being used as well. And then in one of your lessons, at the very end, kind of as an exit card, I guess, you can give them a little frame for them to write the hypothesis for that day's lab experiment in, so that they get to practice writing that structure of the hypothesis was, or the structure of if we add variable 1 to dependent variable 2, then this will happen. And they just kind of fill in the spots, if you like. So it's like a frame for helping them write a hypothesis. And then you're saying to the kids, well, so that's great. Practice at writing hypotheses. Keep that in your lab report, in your lab prac book. Because at the end of the term, you know that you have to conduct your own experiment and write up your own lab report. So you'll be able to go back to this little section that we've done on hypothesis writing to help you when you get to that lab report writing. And then midway through the term, when you're doing some more pracs, you're going to talk about the conclusion. And I'm jumping to the conclusion because what kids don't do well in lab report writing is they don't link their conclusions to their hypotheses. Yep. And that's hugely frustrating for science teachers, but it also kind of forgets what the report is about. So a conclusion is really a reiteration of your hypothesis, and then a discussion of whether, and then a statement of whether it was proved or disproved. So it's a really nice thing to do kind of underneath a hypothesis so that the kids can see how it's a reiteration of a hypothesis. So maybe you'll do a couple of those, give them a little frame to write a conclusion to, and then say, now you know how conclusions are constructed. Keep that in your prac logbook, so you've got that to refer to when you do your final assessment piece. And then you can do the same for method. And I won't go into what I do with method, but one of the things I teach science teachers about is what the passive voice is. So that's my key grammatical thing that I give to science teachers, because the method is written in the passive voice. And passive voice isn't, most other disciplines aren't big fans of passive voice, but science loves it. And for good reason. Passive voice essentially takes the person out of the sentence, and so you don't have to have an I in there or the scientist in there, which we know is not there because that's not part of the method and how science knowledge is replicated. And so what we're doing there, Phil, is building the kids' skill a little each prac. So the teachers are getting through their content, but we're spending 10 minutes every other lesson doing a small component of a lab report, so that over the term the kids have built these skills and can refer back to them when they do that final assessment piece. because this is what usually happens, and I guess the listeners can reflect on this no matter what subject they teach. Very often when I go into secondary schools and I see what the final assessment piece is, and it's always a piece of writing, Phil. Kids are assessed through their writing. So content is assessed through writing. And when I look at the writing assessment piece and then I seek to find where in the unit plan over the term were they taught to write like that, they rarely ever are. So it's so unfair to be asked to display your content knowledge through a written structure that you've not been taught. That, that's just an unfair way to be assessed. So what I'm asking all teachers to do, because it happens in every subject area I look at, is to think about the kind of writing you're asking your kids to do in that final assessment piece, and then find a great model of that kind of writing at the beginning of your unit of work. And examine a little component of that every other lesson, so that the kids do a small dive into a little piece of the writing it won't take up much time. It's quality because you're just looking at a small part and you're essentially building this kid's skills over the term, and then handing over agency to them, saying, when you do this final assessment piece, let's say it's a response to a piece of poetry. So there's a good example, right? In a poetry unit, the kids get to write a lot of poetry, and I love that. But the assessment piece is always a response to a piece of poetry, and they've never done any instruction on how to write responses. So we want to, do the poetry writing. It's great, but also give them opportunities, a little piece of response writing. How do you cite something in a piece of poetry? How do you refer to it, so that you're not just always saying the poem shows, the author shows, this word shows. Show is the favorite oral language verb of all kids when they're writing responses. But if we use a really quality response with them, we could show them how to use words like illustrates. The author, this technique corroborates, this imagery depicts, so that they get to learn these other words like illustrate, depict, corroborate, etc. They won't learn that unless they're looking at really good models of response writing.
I've made a little possible connection here between the primary school and the high school, in that in literacy Sharon and I talk about looking at excellent models of the English language through quality literature, as you're proposing to have quality examples of scientific writing or writing with music, about music, or so it's having those excellent models which gives the authenticity and the way forward, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's exactly the same principle, the same principle. And not only does it kind of build the kids' skills, but Phil, it just makes it more exciting when you're the discipline teacher as well. It's like you find your way back into what you found joyful about your discipline in the first place. And
that's what you're passionate about, so go with that.
Too often, too often we teachers and students just kind of mark time in year 7, 8, 9 and 10. And it's in year 11 and 12 that the discipline teachers get excited again about their the work they do with their kids. And why are they getting excited? Because it's what they remember. It's what they remember that excited them, this kind of critical analysis in English, this exciting kind of investigations in science. And I keep saying, why are you holding off until year 11 and 12? Why don't you let these kids in on the excitement in year 7? Why in English do we just bore our kids to death with things like, with our instruction around, make sure you use a teal paragraph or a Texas paragraph or a Peel paragraph. Kind of the only instruction we do is this kind of bizarre acronym teaching where the kids, if if you're a kid who wants to find your voice and say innovative and creative things, it's really hard to make them fit, TEEL.
We've come to the end of part 1 of our podcast, Effective Literacy Teaching in High Schools. Stay tuned for next week when we tackle part 2.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.